Well, today we're going to start our study of Plato, and we're going to begin with his text, the Apology. Um, in my view, the Apology is the greatest philosophical text there is. And I've read a lot. I've read, large parts of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae and Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Sartre's Being and Nothingness. Even these American philosophers like Sellers or Quine or Dennett. I knew Quine actually a bit. He taught in the philosophy department at Harvard, and so I knew him when I was in the classics department at Harvard. And he, incidentally, he knew ancient Greek, and he was a big fan of the ancient Greek language. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. He's an interesting guy. But anyway, he's an interesting guy, but it doesn't seem to me that anything he wrote or anything that Kant wrote or anything that Aquinas wrote, great as all those things are, none of them compare, it seems to me, with the weight of this short work. It's only, 25 or 30 pages long. I wouldn't want to lose any of those other works, but I'd rather lose them than lose this one. Because I think this is a text that, to my mind, contains almost everything important. And it's a text that it has so much to offer, and it really can be a life-changing text. So we're only going to spend a little bit of time on it. But I hope that spending this little time on it here will make it a text that you'll spend your whole life with. I've certainly spent a lot of years with it now and revisited, and certainly I revisit it in thought very frequently, but I also revisit it by reading it quite frequently. And it's a really amazing text. But so what is it? Well, Apology, it's called the Apology, and it's actually called the Apology of Socrates. Apologia Socrates. Apology is a Greek word that basically means defense speech. And so this is the speech that Socrates, a real person, made in his own defense when he was put on trial, basically for impiety, in Athens in 399 BC. And he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to death because of it. So that right off the bat, that raises a kind of a challenging, funny question, right? We call it Plato's work, Plato's Apology, and yet it's the defense speech that Socrates made, and it's a real thing that happened. Socrates was there, he made a defense speech at his trial and so on. The tricky thing is, the challenging thing is, nobody knows what the relationship is between the words that are contained in Plato's text and the words that Socrates actually spoke at his trial. Some people believe it to be just a verbatim report of what Socrates said. Other people believe it to be almost a total fabrication by Plato, and then of course people believe everything in between. There's no way to answer that question, and that's actually going to be an issue that is an issue that comes up with all of Plato's writings. So it'll be an issue that will come up for us again when we talk about the Republic. Nobody knows what the relationship is between the character who shows up in Plato's writings, Socrates, and the historical figure of Socrates. I mean, everybody knows there's some relationship. Everybody knows that it is a portrayal of the historical figure. And I think that most people believe, I certainly do, that it's a reasonably realistic portrayal. But just how realistic, how much of what we're seeing is the Socrates as he actually was, and how much of it is Plato's invention, nobody knows the answer to that. And so we're not going to be concerned about that. I'm going to treat this as if it is a reasonably realistic portrayal of Socrates, and in that sense I'm going to imagine that we are actually learning something about a real guy who lived basically from 469 BC to 399 BC. But for purposes of our study, not much hangs on that. Second thing is, it's important to remember that neither here nor anywhere else in anything that Plato wrote do you see him expressing his own views in his words. There are some texts that circulate that are purported to be Plato's letters. Everybody agrees that the bulk of them are forgeries. Some people believe that some of them are real. I certainly don't. I don't believe any of them is plausibly written by Plato. But maybe I'm wrong. But in any case, the thing I'm interested in are Plato's, official writings, which is this, and then this apology, and then a whole bunch of other things that we call Plato's dialogues. Dialogues means they're portrayals of conversations, almost always between Socrates and some other people. There are a couple where Socrates either doesn't do much talking or where he isn't even present. But by and large, there are conversations between Socrates and other people. There's no place where Plato writes things in his own name. So we both don't know from these simply what the historical Socrates said, but you also don't know what Plato thinks, any more than you immediately know what William Faulkner thinks when you read one of his novels. Faulkner writes about various characters, Benji and Jason and Quentin and Caddy, I think it is, in The Sound and the Fury, various others. Like you learn a lot of things about those characters, and through seeing these extremely insightful portrayals of human beings, you learn some things about Faulkner. But Faulkner doesn't sit there and tell you what he thinks. Well, similarly here, Plato doesn't tell you what he thinks. He just shows conversations Socrates had with people. So be careful that you don't find yourself saying, Plato says that. Plato doesn't say anything in these dialogues. Socrates says this in this conversation, or the character Socrates says this in this conversation, or the character Glaucon says this in this conversation, and so on. I'm not going to emphasize the difference between the character of Socrates and the historical Socrates, but I do want to emphasize the difference between the character Socrates and Plato, the author. Don't make the mistake of confusing those two. But anyway, with respect to the historical Socrates, I don't know any more than anybody else does what the truth is about this speech. But what everybody does know is that Socrates really was put on trial at Athens. He was found guilty. These are the real charges. And, I think generally speaking, people believe that something like this is what he said, and something like this is who he was. Anyway, that's just a little lead in. So what is this? What does the apology say? Well, the thing that I want to use it for first is to introduce Socrates, to figure out who that guy was, or at least as portrayed here. And I want to do that both for the purpose of thinking, about philosophical questions, which is our main study, but I also want to use that to think a little bit about some of these themes we've already been talking about the historical realities of Athens and Sparta and so on, and put it in that context. Anyway, but so let's talk about this thing, and I want first to talk about the section, the opening section of the it's not a dialogue. There's a little bit of dialogue in it, but it's the speech from 17a to 24b. So those numbers, when I say 17a to 24b, those numbers are the numbers that you'll find written in the margin. And that's kind of where Socrates introduces himself. Then there's a section after that where he directly addresses the charges that have been brought against him by his accusers, Anytus, Miletus, and Lycon. And then there's a section after that where he talks again about what he really stands for. So he says these charges that have been made, they're not compelling. He looks at some problems with the charges, but then he says, look, here's who I really am. And that's another way of sort of answering those charges. And then those are the parts that I really want to focus on, those three separate sections. After that, the jury's going to vote, find him guilty. He's going to make another speech about what he thinks his punishment should be now that he's been found guilty, and then there's another little speech he makes after he's been sentenced to death. So I imagine I'll draw on a few things there too, but I really want to go through these three things. This opening thing where he sort of introduces himself, his engagement with Miletus, his official accuser, and then his next discussion about what he stands for. Anyway, so in this opening discussion, the first thing he says, the first main thing he says is that, yeah, I'm here in court because somebody has brought some specific charges against me, but Um, but that's if that's if that's if that's all you saw happening here, you wouldn't understand what's happening here. That would be too superficial a view. So he says both the reason those charges have been brought against me uh, and the thing that you as jurors are almost certainly going to be basing your judgment on is something else. Like he says, those charges have been brought against me um, because there's a long-standing prejudice against me. And so those charges aren't the real charges. Those charges are just the latest form. A longer running sort of slander has been happening. So he says, um, many have accused me to you, even long ago. They've been talking now for many years, and they've been saying nothing true. And I fear them more than these people who are bringing me charges. Although these guys are dangerous too, he says. But the others are more dangerous. And he says, they got hold of the many of you from childhood, and they accused me and persuaded you, although what they said is no more true than the present charge against me. They persuaded you that Socrates is so and such a guy. And then he goes on to talk about that. He says, these are my dangerous accusers. Actually, let me read one more little bit. He says, moreover, they spoke to you at the age when you were most trusting, when some of you were children and youths, and they accused me in a case that simply was won by default, for no one spoke in my defense. And the most unreasonable thing of all is that it's not even possible to know and say their names. So for that reason, it's not possible to have any of them come forward here and refute him. So in that sense, it's necessary for me simply to speak in my defense as though I were fighting with shadows and refuting with no one to answer. So I want just to think about that situation. So he's saying, I have a reputation, and basically there are rumors about me that people have been spreading, and they've been spreading it throughout my life. So at this point, he says he's 70. So for years, a certain interpretation of him has been circulating. And so that's important for all kinds of reasons, but I'm actually interested first in just the kind of thing he's talking about. He says, people persuaded you when you were children, and no one else spoke in my defense. And when you're children, that's when you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable to hearing things and believing things. You're just sort of taking up the world, saying like, "What is this?" And you're being told this. And one of the things people were told when they were children, is here's Socrates, and et cetera, et cetera. And he also says, these are rumors. These aren't people who actually went to court and said, "I accuse this guy of that," and made a formal declaration and had to go and stand trial. These people say things and they don't get held accountable for what they said. And so people grow up hearing rumors and stuff, and you couldn't even say exactly who you heard it from or where it came from, right? And so he says, I can't call anybody forward. And so there's a general kind of rumor that circulates and that people pick up on, and you can't make it answer to you can't make it say, you can't go up and say, defend those accusations, prove to me that I'm guilty of the things you said. Right? So I want you to think about that structure. First of all, that's one of the very first things he says. It's actually the second thing he says, and I'll go back in 1 second and talk about the first thing he says. This is the second thing he says, and it's pretty. I find that a pretty powerful point because he's talking about something about he's talking about children and what it's like to hear things when you're a child. He's talking about the way our perceptions of things are formed and basically how we take in prejudice in those formative stages, and how those prejudices that we take in, they're hard to get rid of because they're really built into us. But another thing that's pretty striking about them is there's no one to call up, to make them, answer to their accusations, right? They prejudice circulates in a way without anybody taking responsibility for saying it, and so you can't easily fight it. You can't easily challenge it. So I wanted to point to that one. Now, let me take it one step back from there to the very first thing he says. So his opening line is, um, how you men of Athens have been affected by my accusers, I do not know. For my part, even I nearly forgot myself because of them, so persuasively did they speak. He says, but they didn't say anything true. It's interesting, he says, like, I almost forgot who I was when I heard the portrait of me that these people were portraying. Like, they spoke so persuasively, it was almost enough to make me lose my sense of myself. Um, Probably that's a little bit hyperbolic, but nonetheless, people can tell you things about yourself that can overpower your own sense of who you are, and you start thinking, oh yeah, maybe that is who I am, right? Which can take the form either people telling you you're great when you're not, or people telling you that you're not great when, or that you're really bad when you're actually kind of good. It can be very hard, again, especially when you're young, but when you're older too, it can be very hard to hold on to your own sense of who you are when confronted with the power of especially important other people telling you, no, this is who you are, right? So I want you to notice that, and then especially notice the theme he's bringing up there, which is the persuasive rhetoric of people speaking. So there he's saying, my official accusers who've just come to court and made these charges against me, he says the things they said are false, but they really layered it on. They made good speeches, but it really tried to convince you of this thing that's false. I want you to notice that something about that extremely persuasive power of language. The way language can be used to persuade and can be very persuasive, that doesn't automatically mean it's true. So the opening thing he leads with is the striking and perhaps troubling power of language. And he connects that to the challenge of forming a sense of who you are in light of who other people say you are. And then he goes on to say the thing I mentioned a minute ago, this business about how we are persuaded as children by these things we take in, and it's hard to challenge those things, and there's no straightforward person you can name who taught you some of those things, right? So I want to note those things first. It's interesting that in this speech, Socrates, at least as portrayed by Plato, begins by noting those powers of persuasion through language and communication, especially as those pertain to our sense of who we are and who others are. Anyway, but so all of those things will come back. But let's get on with the actual court case. So he says, these people have accused me, and so he says, well, what did they accuse me of? Well, there's nobody we can call up to come and make the charge. But let's imagine somebody were doing that. Like, what would they say? And so this is at 19b. He says, what did the slanderers say to slander me? Well, their sworn statement, just as if they were accusers, should be read. So I'm going to portray it as if they're making their case here. So here's what the accusation would have been. Socrates does injustice and is meddlesome. And he does those things by investigating the things under the earth and the heavenly things, and by making the weaker speech the stronger, and by teaching others these same things. So he's being accused of, injustice. Saying this is why I'm bringing him to court. And the particular charges are investigating the things under the earth and heavenly things, number one. Number two, making the weaker speech, the weaker argument, the stronger. And number three, teaching others these same things. He says those are the prejudices against me. Those are the things I'm accused of being. But he's going to say none of those things are true. I want you to think about those three. The first one, investigating the things under the earth and in the heavens. I'm going to even say one more thing, and then I'm going to say that. Those three, investigating the things under the earth and in the heavens, making the weaker argument the stronger, and teaching others to do the same things. those are things that some guy was saying about a reputation he had in ancient Greece, in Athens, in 450 BC or whatever. So they can seem like old things, but in fact, it seems to me those accusations are all very familiar. Right? So people who investigate things in the heavens and under the earth, that's roughly what in our contemporary language, we would just call a scientist. People who make the weaker argument the stronger, that's how we often think of lawyers, at least corrupt ones, right? We often culturally, have a view that like those lawyers can get somebody off even though that person was a criminal, right? So they can make it seem like the thing that should get somebody punished actually makes them a star, makes them a great guy. So that idea of making the weaker argument appear stronger, we're familiar with that. It seems to be very much from specifically the way we sometimes characterize lawyers, and it's not just that. Like we might also think of other people that way too. Other people use their speech to mislead, like advertisers in general, whether it's advertisers for a particular product or whether it's lobbyists for the oil industry. We think of people who take bad things and make them look good through persuasive use of words and misleading manipulation of argument and so on. So making the weaker argument the stronger, like we've heard that one before. And then the last one, teach others to do the same. Well, it's basically teaching, right? So he basically says, I've been accused of being a scientist, a lawyer, and a teacher, or something like that. All of those, at least the first two, scientist and lawyer, having kind of negative connotations. I'll say something about that in a minute. And then teacher, he's teaching other people to do those same bad things. Let's take that first one. Why would investigating things under the earth and in the heavens be a bad thing? Why would it be a bad thing to be a scientist? We read recently the second chorus of Sophocles Antigone, right? And remember in that one, they're saying many are the wonders, and the thing about human beings, man, anthropos, mankind. I'll stick with the word man just because of the translation we used. Man has taught himself speech, winds, swift thought, and the tempers that go with city living. And because of that, he has contrivances that give him a way against everything except death, right? And those contrivances, many can master the beasts of the field and so on. I'm not quoting it verbatim, but you should remember those lines that are saying that kind of thing. So remember, those were the points that were being made in that thing. And remember how it ended. It said, if he honors the laws of the earth and the justice of the gods he has confirmed by oath, then high is his city. But he has no city with whom dwells dishonor guided by recklessness, or something like that. Anyway, the point I wanted to bring you back to there was that idea that, yes, the man is a wonder, and that wonder has to do with our speech and windswift thought and the tempers that come with city living. And the powers that those give us for, in a sense, mastering nature or getting it such a way that we can build a world that's worth living in an environment that otherwise would, crush us or whatever. Well, high is his city who honors the laws of the earth. Remember, earth, oldest of gods, unwearied and immortal. As the plows go across her year after year. But so the point was, we have those powers, and it matters whether we use them in a way that honors the gods, basically, or whether we falsely imagine that we're the masters, right? So that was kind of the point of that thing. Like, do you recognize a higher thing you need to serve, or are you just recklessly using your contrivances to think you can overpower nature and so on. Well, if you remember that, you might be able to think about why someone might think that the scientist who investigates things under the earth and in the heavens isn't automatically that good. In the Athens of Socrates' day, those kinds of scientific explorations, I guess, were relatively new, and I think the concern that there was a lack of respect for deeper values that would be associated with those new kinds of scientific endeavors, that concern was probably pretty substantial, probably more substantial than you would find in a contemporary environment where we take it for granted that our kids are going to go to school and learn physics and chemistry and so on. So in that way, ancient Athens probably had more of a distrust of science than our culture, which kind of is in love with it. But I think we can appreciate something of that distrust if you think about the kinds of concerns people might have right now about the reckless indifference of companies that use technological powers that come from scientific investigations for the sake of amassing great wealth for themselves while destroying the natural environment or destroying the lives of people or whatever. Like we have in our culture come to think of negatively of a kind of reckless conceit that the scientist might have in thinking that she or he or they is master, and that there is nothing about their scientific investigations worthy of criticism. It's just straightforward truth, right? I think we have seen quite a few reasons for being critical of that kind of self-interpretation. So I bring that up so you might be able to think about why someone might think, yeah, I don't exactly trust a guy who investigates things under the earth and in the heavens. We in our culture do generally trust those people, whereas in Athens that could be held up as someone who really was failing to appreciate what's important about nature in this kind of wonderful sense. Anyway, but that's the first charge. I just want you to think about that a little bit. The second one, Socrates is accused of making the weaker argument the stronger. Well, as I was already saying, like, we're familiar with a kind of negative view about that, the dishonest lawyer or the dishonest advertiser. So Socrates, people are saying, look, we think that's what you do. You don't care about anything that's important. You don't know about the important things. You just go and you just think the earth is just a bunch of dirt you can dig in to find gold and get rich or something like that. You don't respect its importance, or you're just a guy who thinks he can play with words and trick people who aren't as good with words, So he's saying he's been accused of that, and then he's been accused of teaching other people to do those same things. And he says none of those things are true. So Socrates is himself, I think, more than anyone else, the figure of the philosopher. And that's one of the reasons why I say this is the greatest text. I mean, I think this text it's about Socrates, but it's kind of about the person who is a philosopher. And so the things that Socrates says he's been accused of, I mean, those are the kinds of things philosophy has always been accused of. Think of more traditional religious people don't want their kids studying philosophy in the same way they don't want them studying the natural sciences, right? They think of that as too much trusting in the use of rationality to figure out how to manipulate the world without really appreciating deeper values. Too much enthusiasm for the human powers. They don't like people learning how to play with words. They don't trust the arguments they're made. They think, I'm a good, honest guy who can think straightforward thoughts. I don't want to talk with these people who use fancy words and stuff like that. And maybe they don't want you going to university because that's where people teach that kind of stuff. Right? These are real accusations that are made. I don't know if they're the kinds of things you hear from your parents, but they're certainly things that exist in the world pretty prominently. So the point that I'm trying to make then is that the thing that Socrates is being charged with, or Socrates' situation, I guess I could say, is on the one hand just the personal situation of an actual guy who was put on trial in 399. Right? So we're just reading personal circumstances, and it would be interesting enough if that were all it were. But it also seems to me that it is remarkably emblematic of a much larger reality of what philosophy as such is. So I'm going to give you that to think about. Anyway, let me just carry on with this. So then Socrates is going to make his defense against those first charges. And he said, okay, first of all, anybody who actually knows me knows that investigating things under the earth and in the sky is not what I do. And he's going to go on later to tell us what I do. But he says, I'm not a scientist. That's not what I'm a philosopher. That's not what I do. I don't get out my microscope. And he also says, people have accused me of going around teaching people. He says, and there are such people who go around teaching and getting paid for it. And he says, I'm not one of those. I'm not even a teacher in that sense. And that then leads him to talk a little bit about some of the people who are teachers. These are people who are often called sophists. I won't get into the details there, but he names a number of figures who were quite well known in that society at the time who did go around from city to city offering instruction, especially in how to speak well, how to make arguments in the law court. And so there are people associated with making the weaker argument stronger and so on. And they also was purported to teach goodness, to teach you how to be a good person and so on. And they weren't always trusted as people who could do that. Again, it was at least sometimes seems that those people were trying to teach, how to get ahead and how to get powerful, which is a little different from how to be good in the more everyday sense of good. But anyway, Socrates says, okay, there are those guys. They go around teaching money. He says, that's great. Like if I could teach people how to be good and charge money for it, that'd be a great thing. But I don't do that. So he says, I've been accused of these things, but they're not things I do. And so then he says, page 68 of this, so that's 20, at 20c, he says, well, okay, Socrates, you've told us all these things, but he says, perhaps then one of you might retort, well, Socrates, what is your affair? What is it that you do? Where did these slanders come from? Right? And somebody would say, there must be something about you that makes it sensible for people to accuse you of these things. He says, yes, that's right. There is something about me that has produced these accusations, but nonetheless, the accusations are not true.
So Socrates begins his story, his little autobiography, by saying that the reason this stuff has happened to him is because he has a certain wisdom. That's a 20d. And wisdom now is going to be what his whole story revolves around. Remember, Philo-sophia, is the love of wisdom. So this is the story of his life, but it also is in a way defining what philosophy is about. So the story begins at 21a with his friend Chaerophon. So his friend Chaerophon once went to the Delphic Oracle, and the oracle at Delphi was something you could consult. You could consult the priestess there, the priestess of Apollo, ask questions and get answers that were a little bit riddling, a little bit like riddles. Lots of stories about that, but I won't get into that. In any case, his friend Chaerophon went and asked, is anyone wiser than Socrates? And the Pythian princess or priestess apparently replied, "No one is wiser than Socrates." So that's a pretty striking claim. And so I guess Chaerophon brought that news back to Socrates, and Socrates thought, I don't understand. It doesn't make any sense to me because I don't think of myself as wise. It doesn't make any sense for the priestess to say that, to essentially name me as the wisest. And so then that he says that sort of defined his life's activity, which was to go to those people who are deemed to be wise. Notice that issue of sort of reputation again, or public reputation, but people who we take to be wise, and he would go and try to see what their wisdom was, to sort of test this thing he'd heard from the Delphic Oracle, because he didn't think he was wise. He thought somebody's got to be wiser than I am. So he went to see the supposedly wise people, and the basic story is it turned out they weren't wise. So we want to think about what happened there. But before we get into the details of that, I would get you just to think about wisdom and to think what do we mean by that? Why do we care about it? And where or with whom do we expect to find it? So I'll just give you a few thoughts about that before jumping back into the book. So, what is it? Wisdom, I guess we normally think of that as roughly in the domain of knowledge. We're talking about something about the things people know, but we don't generally equate the words wisdom and knowledge, because we think, oh, somebody can know a lot and they're not very wise. So wisdom doesn't seem to mean just having acquired learning, right? We tend to think of it as something more like having good judgment and being able to know well what the right thing is to do in a situation or something like that. It's not even just that immediately narrow what to do in a situation. It's also knowing what the important things are about life, about reality. Right? So I won't try to play that out a lot more, but I'd like you to think about that before you jump into sort of talking about these issues and seeing the things that happen. You should think about that. Like, what do we mean by wisdom? And this isn't a sort of an idiosyncratic question. What do you happen to think wisdom is? It's a much more basic question about what we as human beings mean. Why for human beings is the issue of wisdom a real one? What is it that why do we care about it, and what is it that we're really struggling with when we're after wisdom? So that's the first thing to think about, and I give you a couple of thoughts there about how to think about what we mean by it. And then, where do we find it, or with whom? Well, actually, I guess I'd also said, why do we want it? And I guess we want wisdom for a few reasons. Most basically because we want to live well. I think we want to know what the truth is. We want to live well. We want to handle things fairly, I guess, again, you can think about that question. Where do we look for it? I would think there that some of the most obvious places we want and look for wisdom are with respect to people in positions of leadership. Right? We want our political leaders to be wise. We want them to know what's what and to make good judgments about how to deal with big things. And, so we live our lives not dealing with all kinds of issues like the handling of international trade agreements. I used that example a while ago. The making of laws, the funding of important enterprises throughout the country. Like, those are important things, but we don't do it. We may have passing opinions about it, but we spend our time buying our groceries and going out with our friends and whatever. We leave it to someone else to do those things. So they're important things, but we figure somebody else is going to handle that. And that's typically what we expect the government to do, right? So really, political leaders are people that we're counting on to be making wise decisions about how to run our world and make a good functioning life available to us. Teachers, we want our teachers to know a lot, and we want them to make wise judgments about what it is that we need to study. So, we think those people have gone through, they've blazed a path through the woods or whatever. They learned their stuff. Now we count on them to come and tell us what we need to know so that we can move forward with our important things, right? So we want our teachers to be wise at every level, from, the university lecturers all the way back down to the grade 1 teachers, right? We want those people to be wise too in assessing well, judging well what 6-year-olds need to know, right? And then the next one would be parents. I imagined one of the most important groups that we always want to be wise will be our parents. We want our parents to make wise decisions, wise judgments about our upbringing, about the handling of our lives, and so on. There are probably others too, but I would like to point to those ones just to get you thinking about where we expect wisdom and what we want it to be. Actually, let me add a couple more. Where else might you want wisdom? I imagine you might want wisdom in your church leaders, your priest, your minister. There, I think probably a lot of people would want that. They think this should be a person to whom I can turn for guidance in important matters about life issues, whether it's how to raise my child or how to deal with the problems in my marriage or whatever, moral issues in interactions or in whatever. And I guess another one, just carrying on with that, your therapist. I want your therapist to be wise. And then I guess another one, so those are particular individuals that we want to be making wise decisions or be able to guide us in wise decisions about practical life. But I suppose their wisdom has to come from somewhere. And so we also, wisdom I think also then means not just good practical judgment, but it also means something like insight, right? We want people to make their decisions based on insight. And so we also then think of certain people as the great sources of insight, like, the great philosophers. We presumably think of them as the wise ones, right? The people who really figured stuff out and are telling us the deep, profound truths we need to know. And maybe also great artists. We think of that way, like even everyday artists, pop artists. You like to. There's songs that are good to dance to or whatever, but song lyrics can also be pretty powerful, and there you get sort of something more like poetry. And in situations like that, you sometimes think, oh yeah, those words really spoke to something in my life. So like similarly there, I think with artists we sometimes expect or hope for wisdom because we think their works, perhaps most obviously in something like poetry, but probably this is also true in other arts as well, we expect their work to reveal to us, to make available to us powerful and important ways of seeing our world or something like that, right? So now I added these other ones, right? So I started with political leaders, teachers, and parents. Then I've added religious leaders, therapists, philosophers, artists, right? That's I think a pretty good list, and it gives something of the range of people from whom we'd expect wisdom. You can work on that on your own and think of your own sense of what that is, but I want you to do that. I want you to think about what wisdom is and where we look for it on your own so that you can then see the significance of the things Socrates is saying. So he says what he did first is he went to a prominent politician. And that makes sense. Like that's one of the places you might think to go for wisdom. And he said he went and talked to that guy. And this starts, I think, I wrote it down here. Yeah, 21b. He went to 21b. He went and talked to that guy and listened to what the guy said, and didn't seem wise at all. So he talked to him and discovered that the guy didn't know what he was talking about. So this now is going to be the core of the identity of Socrates, and maybe the identity of philosophy. He said, actually, let me read a little bit here. He says, I went to one of those reputed to be wise, on the ground that there, if anywhere, I would refute the divination and show the oracle, this man is wiser than I, but you declared that I'm wisest. What's going on here? So I considered him thoroughly. I won't tell you who he was, but he was one of the politicians. And when I considered him and conversed with him men of Athens, I was affected something like this. It seemed to me that this man seemed to be wise, both to many other human beings and most of all to himself, but that he was not. So, from this, I became hateful, both to him and to many of those present. So there's the little capsule of Socrates. Basically, what Socrates did there, and what he did throughout his life, what he does, what his affair is that he goes around talking to people who are supposedly wise or who suppose themselves to be wise, and he asks them basically to tell him what they know, to teach him, to show him what their wise insights. But then he examines them, like he asks them questions about it. He says, "Oh, what do you mean by that? When you say this, do you mean this? Whatever." Like he takes them to know what they're talking about, tries to interact with them, and in the course of talking with them, discovers that they don't know what they're talking about. And he says that's made him hateful, right? So Socrates' form of interaction, in fact, ends up putting on display that people don't know what they're talking about. And that makes people embarrassed and angry. And they get angry at him. They don't get angry at themselves for being ignorant. They get angry at him for showing it. That's a point he makes a little bit later when he's talking about, a few paragraphs on, when he's talking about what the young people do who follow him. I'm going to say another thing about that, but let me just quickly say what comes up in the next few paragraphs. So he went and talked to a politician, then he went and talked to more politicians. Same thing happened. Then he says he moved on to the poets, the tragic poets like Sophocles, that type of person, that kind of person who wrote the tragedy that we read, the Antigone, or that we talked about. But he talked to basically artists, but specifically he's talking about people who put things in words. And he said he asked them, he says we think of them as people with offering great wisdom too. I mean, that's why I turned to reading Sophocles Antigone, because I thought there's wisdom here. That's why we're reading in our philosophy class. But he said he talks to the authors of these things, and the works may be great, but the authors don't automatically get the point of their own works. So the politicians, they talk big and they got nothing. The artists make great works, but they don't understand their own works. And then he said, then he went to a third group. He calls it the artisans, the manual artisans, is translated to. But people, the ancient Greek equivalent, I guess, of car mechanics, house builders, plumbers, and things like that. And he says the interesting thing here is these are people who actually do know something. They really do know how to fix a car, build a house, whatever it is. So they think they know something, and they're right. Those other people, he said, are people who think they know something, think they're wise about something, but it turns out they don't know what they don't know what they think they know. They're actually ignorant when they think they're knowledgeable. He says these people, these artisans, think they know something, and they're right to know something. They're right, they do know something. But, he says, characteristically, he found that those people, presumably because they know something in one domain, take themselves to know a lot more than that. They take themselves, because they're good car mechanics, they think they're experts in politics, So he said these people turn out not to be wise either, because they wrongly imagine they know things they don't know too, just like those other folks. Even though they do know something, they wrongly imagine themselves to know something further. So Socrates goes through all these groups, and so the basic thing that's happening is he's going to these people, talking to them about what they claim to know, and through examining them, through asking questions about what they claim to know, it comes to be clear that they don't know what they're talking about. And by thus putting their ignorance on display, he has incurred hatred. He says, this is right at the very end of 22b and the beginning of 23a, he says, "This is the examination, men of Athens, from which I have incurred many hatreds, the sort that are harshest and gravest, so that many slanders have arisen from them, and I got this name of being wise." Right? So, he said at the beginning, he does actually have a certain wisdom. We'll talk about that in a second. But he said, it's from this thing that people have called him wise, like a wise guy, I guess. Either because they think he's just being a a jerk and showing these people up, or maybe actually this is the same thing, or they think, well, okay, you must know better than us because you can show us up. Well, what he actually says is different than. Here's what he says his wisdom actually is. This is right after he talks about the first person he examined, that politician. And this is at 21d. He says, well, so he's just said, I earned the hatred of this guy. And he says, for my part, as I went away, I reasoned with regard to myself, well, I am wiser than this human being. For probably neither of us knows anything particularly noble or good, but he supposes he knows something when he does not know, while I, just as I do not know, do not even suppose that I do. So I am likely to be a bit wiser than he is in this very thing, namely, that whatever I do not know, I do not even suppose that I know. Right? So Socrates then says the real difference between him and these other people is not that he has deep, profound knowledge about things, but that he knows that he doesn't. Whereas these other people pump themselves up, but pump themselves up to themselves and to others by claiming or believing about themselves, claiming to know or believing about themselves that they know things they don't really know. So Socrates' wisdom is to know that he doesn't know, and that he says is how he came to understand the meaning of the oracle saying that no one was wiser than Socrates, and to see that in a certain way it's true. And so when he said back at 20d that he has a certain wisdom, that's the certain wisdom he has. So that's basically his story then, that he has the wisdom to know that he doesn't know ultimate things. He knows the limits of his own knowledge. He knows that in a fundamental way he's ignorant. And what he has done throughout his whole life is to talk to people reputed to be wise, and through the process of examining them, through the process of asking them to explain what it is that they believe they know, he's come to learn and to show, to put on display, that they don't actually know what they know. And that's why he's now being hated, and that's where these slanders have arisen. Because people think, oh, you're using words in a tricky way, that kind of stuff. That's making the weaker argument the stronger. So I want you then that's his basic story. I want you to think about the issues raised there about wisdom and knowledge. I want you to think about his point that practice is what has brought about those slanders and so on, and think about the relationship between his actual practice and the old charges and so on. And then, but last, I want you also to think about the distinctive thing he does, and that is basically what has come to be called Socratic method. And that is, he himself is not someone who professes to know something. He doesn't go around saying, I'm now going to teach you the truth about these things, right? At some level, your physics teacher does that, or your economics professor does that. People say, here's the stuff you got to know. I know all the stuff, right? Well, Socrates doesn't do that. He's not a lecturer. And that's why he's not, I guess, like those sophists who can claim to go around and be able to teach virtue. He says, no, I don't have the wisdom to hand to you, right? So I don't have a product I'm going to sell you. I'm going to teach you this thing. But what his method actually is to examine the claims of others. And so people say something that they believe to be true, and he asks them questions about it. And through asking them questions, he gets them to basically, in conversation with him, to think through their own beliefs. And that process of thinking through their beliefs by conversing with him generally reveals that their beliefs are a mess of incoherent contradictions, right? That people's thinking isn't particularly clear, and that we believe things and believe ourselves to know things on insufficient grounds. And so this is basically then what Socrates does, and he says that's a good thing. You should examine your beliefs. And so he says he's doing the work of the god. He says he's actually helping people. That people get angry at him, but they shouldn't, because what he's really doing is testing beliefs to discover whether we do know what we think we know. And so his actual goal, what he does for himself and what he thinks other people should do, is to be self-responsible in their thinking and not just live on the basis of prejudices and presumptions and so on. Presumptions and so on. So that's the basic story. Oh, let me add one last thing, and this is at 23c. Yeah, just this other thing. He says, the other thing that has happened is that young rich kids have followed me around. They got nothing better to do. They've got money and time, so they follow me around, and they have imitated those practices. And so other people see me doing this and think, oh, that's a cool thing. And so they go and ask people questions and get them tied up in things, get people angry. And so then people say, oh, Socrates is teaching other people to do this irritating thing. And so that has something to do with being a teacher of these things. Anyway, so think about that story. And that sort of completes his basic autobiography. Here are the charges against me. Here's what I really do. And so he says, look, that's I've refuted the old charges, right? I've shown that I am not that guy they say I am in those stories, but I do something, and this is what I do. So let's pause this there, and then we'll go on to look at his actual exchange with his current accuser, Miletus.